Hi, this is Aaron with Reality Emotive Systems Theory. Today we're going to talk about assessing clients to determine what interventions are best for them. To start off, we're going to talk about Carl Tom's ethical postures, but we're going to adapt it a little bit to apply to Reality Emotive Systems Theory. Let's start off with the collaborative posture. Now, the therapist here, we'll have a therapist here, and a client here, and in this posture that the therapist takes, he takes a collaborative approach where the client has their own perception of reality, the therapist also has his own perception of reality, but the therapist can see the client's perception. And in this process that the therapist sees the client's perception of reality, the therapist realizes that the client is perceptive of his problems in his life, and the client actually has many interventions that he's used in the past that have been effective in resolving problems in the past. But right now, the client is kind of constrained, in a situation where he isn't implementing those interventions that have worked in the past. And so the therapist, in this approach, he works collaboratively with the client to find out what interventions have worked in the past. And so in this approach, the therapist he just listens, and the client does all the talking, or does a lot of talking. The therapist just asks questions. Hey, what's worked in the past? How have you overcome this in the past? You've obviously been around for a long time, so you've found some things that work. And this is a very much solution-focused approach, narrative approach. These are basically postmodern therapy model approaches where the therapist views the client's perception of reality and tries to help the client resolve their problems inside of the client's perception of reality. So the therapist is not trying to burst their bubble by any means. The therapist is just trying to help the client fix things within their own perception of reality. That was the collaborative approach. Now let's talk about the overt interventions. Basically a posture in which the therapist takes overt interventions and opposed to covert interventions. So the therapist here is very open with the client. The client is actually has tried different things in the past to help him, but got them wrong, or been misled on how to resolve problems in their life. So the client has a perception of reality that hasn't been working. The interventions they've tried just don't work. So the therapist sees that the client doesn't really have coping skills or strategies to help him, so that the therapist tries to expand the client's perception of reality. So expanding, we'll have some little arrows to show that his reality is expanding. The therapist will teach the client and show the client different interventions, different ways to resolve their problems. And this is the posture of overt interventions. Now let's talk about the posture of strategic interventions. So we have a therapist here, and we have a client here, and the client is a little resistant to treatment. The client they may or may not know what's best for them, but they're a little resistant. They don't want to do it. And so they don't want to expand their perception of reality to see what the therapist sees, because they're resistant. And the therapist sees this, so the therapist tries to fix the client's perception of reality within that client's perception of reality. Very similar to collaborative, where the therapist does not try to expand that person's perception of reality. In fact, the therapist tries to work within that perception of reality. But in this situation, the therapist is the one who comes up with different interventions, different ideas, and tells the client what to do, or tells the client's family what to do to change that person's environment. In fact, it's most common to have people in the client's life change their behaviors to change this client's reality. And I'm going to give examples of all of these a little later. But right now we're just going with this. So this is strategic interventions. Now let's talk about covert interventions. The posture of having covert interventions. You have a therapist here and a client here, and the client is a little naive, or maybe they just don't know, they're unaware of their environment. This could be a young child, this could be somebody who is mentally impaired, learning disabilities of some type, but for some reason this client is unaware of what's going on outside of their reality. The therapist can see that, and so the therapist does a unique intervention because the therapist is not able to teach the client through expanding their perception of reality, and the client isn't able to come up with their own interventions, and they may struggle even with having the other family members fix that perception of reality or their environment. So the therapist will do some covert interventions and in a way manipulate the client to change their behavior. So I am going to give an example of this, but we're going to put, first of all, little arrows. We'll put them this way, little arrows to, we narrow the client's perception of reality. We narrow that, and the client is not aware of the therapist's purpose behind these interventions. Let me give you an example. So I once had a client who was a 15-year-old boy, and actually he was probably 14 years old. He had the intelligence level of probably a 6-year-old. And this young man, he had a lot of anger problems. In fact, he once took a pencil and stabbed a staff in the neck with a pencil because he was angry. And so his intelligence level is very low. And so he needed some help because he was naive, he was unaware. He just didn't know how to function in society. So, we would actually have problems at our facility with him because he would get angry from time to time, and then he'd start walking off, and he would walk down the highway, and the police would drive by and see this young man from our facility, an RTC facility, a residential treatment center facility, and he would pick up the this client and bring him back, and we would have to deal with legal problems because of the police. But anyways, we wanted him to still have that healthy coping skill of walking instead of being in an area and fighting. But at the same time, we wanted him to walk in a safe location, not near traffic, not in an area that he would get in any trouble legally. So every day, actually it was twice a week, I would go walk with this client up a trail behind our property, behind our building, still on our property. We'd go hike up this hill together, and I didn't tell him why we were hiking up that hill, but we would do that twice a week regularly, walk up and down that hill. And it was a beautiful scenery. It was a great opportunity for him to go and walk and relieve steam at times. But we didn't tell him what our intentions were, but subconsciously he was programming his mind. And we, because of this intervention, one day he got angry and he was getting to the point that he wanted to hurt somebody, but instead he got up, walked out, and then walked up that hill. Instead of walking down the highway, being close to traffic, he changed his behavior and started walking up the hill where it was safe. This is a great example of a covert intervention and taking that posture as a therapist. So each of these are different therapeutic, ethical postures. We've talked about the covert. Let's talk a little bit about the strategic. This won't be a personal story, but I really love the strategic story of this woman who came into therapy saying that she was depressed. She was so depressed that she wanted to commit suicide. And the therapist saw that the client, she was committed, and she was not going to listen to the therapist say, hey, don't commit suicide. And so the therapist knew that she had made her mind up. So instead of telling her, don't do that, the therapist said, hey, how much money do you have saved up? And she said, about $10,000. I'm just throwing out a number. And he said, well, you were going to commit suicide anyways. Before you do that, how about you go and spend that money and maybe give yourself a makeover, buy some new dresses, make yourself feel good. And so she did that. And what I didn't mention earlier is one of the reasons why this woman was so depressed is because she felt that she was ugly. She felt like she wasn't very attractive. It was difficult for her to get dates. And there was a guy at work that she was really interested in, but she couldn't get his attention. But she took the therapist's suggestion, his intervention, with staying within her perception that she wants to commit suicide. He said, well, why don't you spend some money? Go and make yourself look pretty. And so she did, and guess what? The next time they met, she said, I don't want to commit suicide anymore. I did what you said. I bought all new clothes. I gave myself a makeover, and people pay attention to me now. In fact, the guy that I like at work, he asked me out on a date, and everything is going great because the therapist changed the environment of the client. She changed the perception of reality for that client. He used a strategic intervention, and she was able to change. Let's talk a little bit about actually let's go over this one, the collaborative approach. I do like to start off with this posture at the beginning of treatment. The reason why I like to take this approach is because most of my clients that come into therapy to see me, they've gone to therapy before, or they've lived a lot, and they lived long enough that they have tried different things. Some things work, some things don't. So I take this opportunity to assess. I don't do a lot of talking, I do a lot of listening. So I find out what has worked in the past so that the client can focus on those certain interventions. And in that process, it won't solve everything. Sometimes it does, but it does help. I once had a client who he came into therapy. He was oppositional defiant, and he was actually probably in a section right here. And I realized that my client, he was so oppositional, I wasn't going to be able to help him change his behaviors or change his reality unless I integrated his family. So I changed his environment around him through his family. And his father and his mom, they were very much in this situation. They have had many counseling sessions before. They have had parenting classes. And so I was very inquisitive. What has worked in the past? And they were like, oh yeah, this worked in the past, but we stopped doing it. And I was like, well, go do it. And the more and more they started doing those interventions that have worked for them in the past, it started changing the environment of my client who was oppositional defiant. And so my oppositional defiant client, his behavior was actually improving. But that is one of the a really good example that I have of being collaborative. I was collaborative with the parents so that my client with oppositional defiant disorder could change his behavior, and everyone was happier. Let's now talk a little bit about the overt positions, the overt interventions. So I once had a client when I was working as a wilderness guide. So this client, he had a pretty bad anger problem, and he came to me and he asked me, Aaron, what can I do whenever I am confronted with someone who says anything about my brother or says anything about my drug problem? I lose it, and I get in a fight or get in trouble. And this client here that I met with, he wanted to change, but his mind was programmed in the wrong way. His subconscious was programmed to be conflicting with someone when they talked about his brother or his drug problem. So he was in a situation where he was open to finding new ways and finding out a different coping skill other than fighting. But his reality was still this negative way. So what I did is I sat him down and we talked about it, and I taught him certain interventions to help him reprogram his mind. And in this way, it expanded his perception of reality. It was retraining his mind. One of the things that I told him to do was to meditate, and in the meditations, imagine yourself doing a different behavior other than fighting. So before, he had a constricted perception of reality of just fighting, but now I expanded his perception of reality of this is another behavior I could do in replacement of, or in addition to, or whatever, just more options than just fighting. So I really was expanding his perception, not only through him asking me questions, but through me also having him teach himself new things. So that is the posture of overt interventions. So each of these different interventions come from different therapy models. But of course, reality emotive systems theory is a meta-modern therapy model in that we believe that we can switch between different modalities. And the reason why that this is alright is because even though we have different interventions that we can do for one client, we stick to that intervention for an appropriate goal. So when I start treatment, I usually start with this postmodern approach of more of a solution focus, and I find out, oh, these are some interventions that have worked in the past. Let's not change that because it works. So for that particular goal or that particular issue, we have this type of intervention. But then later in treatment we realize, oh, there are some other goals that they don't have answers to. Maybe they're naive to those. Maybe they are resistant to those goals. Or maybe they are willing to learn more to resolve those goals. So there are different approaches based upon the need of that individual goal. And that's how we implement meta-modern therapy models in our reality emotive systems theory. Thank you. If you enjoyed this video, please go to our website to learn more